were listening to the first segment of our 8-part series, Bountiful Beans, with Susan Wade at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Hi, Gemini. I am always so delighted to spend time here at Time Monk Radio with you and everyone else. Green blessings, everybody.
Thank you. So lovely to have you again.
And, I've always seen myself as the kind of crazy herbalist who kept saying, yes, but aren't there milder herbs? Yes, but aren't there milder herbs? Because when I started studying herbal medicine, it was very much like in an inner way validated by the fact that drugs are made out of herbs. But the kind of push was to use the strongest possible herbs to get the strongest possible reactions. And I kept wanting to help people be better by using softer ways and by using herbs that were less and less severe and that tasted better and better. And, of course, where that wound me up was with Nourishing Herbal Infusions and right back at one of those very famous sayings, which is, let your food be your medicine. And I find that more and more I am bridging that gap between what is food and what is herbal medicine, and encouraging people to see everything on their plate as herbal medicine, and to treat it in the same way that they would treat herbs. What's the best way to get what I can get from this particular plant? Because plants are very crafty. Plants are our ancestors. Plants are the ancient ones. They've been here for millions and millions of years before us. And they're quite crafty at learning how to avoid being eaten, or learning how to not give nutrition when they're eaten so that we don't keep on eating them. And so it does take a little skill and a little learning. And I think that's one of the reasons, we're always grumpy, Americans don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And it's partly because you need to have a little expertise in order to figure out how to get into the goods in those fruits and vegetables. So I'm really excited that we're going to spend the summer months looking at beans. And it's partly because, aren't beans part of the summer? Of course, they're part of the winter, too. But cookouts, baked beans? Well, of course. And beans are indeed the magical fruit, although they're not technically a fruit at all. They are a seed. The more you eat, the more you toot. This does indeed keep some people away from beans, doesn't it? But I want to start us off by looking at beans not so much from the human perspective, but from the soil perspective. And beans, also known as legumes or pulses, and to the botanist, the Fabaceae is a very, very large family of plants. And it includes small herbaceous plants and large woody trees. So it's a big family, lots of members in the family, lots of different ways that they present themselves to us. But every member of this family does one critical thing for all the rest of the plants on the planet, and that is they are able to take nitrogen from the air, and by means of bacteria, which are living in nodules on the roots of bean plants, they are able to fix that nitrogen into the soil, making it available to plants. Nitrogen is to plants as protein is to human beings. We need protein. It's the building block of DNA. Just so plants need nitrogen. When you say, I'm going to fertilize this plant, what you generally mean is I'm going to be giving it nitrogen. Now, just as we don't live on protein alone, plants don't live on nitrogen alone. And this is part of the problem with modern farming, is that fertilizers are pretty much just nitrogen, whereas other nitrogenous fertilizers, anywhere from animal manures to rotted nettles, are very, very rich in minerals. and other substances that plants actually can consume and become healthier for it. But the beans provide that baseline, that nitrogen, without which none of the rest of the plants could really get along. The ability to bring the nitrogen out of the air and into the soil is one of the most critical life-giving functions that occurs on our planet as a whole, and it's the beans that do it. So with that in mind, let us venture into the realm of the beans. Over the next 8 weeks, we are going to be looking at green beans and shelled beans, anasazi beans and lima beans. We're going to be looking at peas and peas porridge, and we're going to be looking at lentils and their magic. We're going to be looking at soybeans, trying to figure out, are they healthy or is it all just a hoax? Chickpeas and fava beans, and do I have a funny fava bean story for you? And then we're going to look at some medicinal beans, including astragalus and red clover. And I've saved the best for last, which is crazy beans. So grab your can of baked beans or sit down with your tall glass of iced red clover infusion, and let's find out what the beans have to tell us. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, you who nourish life. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, you whose magic turns air into food. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, in my heartbeat, in my gut. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, through my nerves, between my legs. Pulse, pulse, pulsing. You enhance the soil, you who beat in time. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, you who nurture animals, you who feed the bees. Pulse, pulse, pulsing, you whose roots embrace the world. Ground me, feed me, teach me. Pulse, pulse, pulse in me. Laughing legumes, bountiful beans, roll me over in the clover and giggle me pink. A long time ago, long before the two-leggeds walked on Earth, there were terrible storms, lashing rain, and hurricanes of wind would gout from ebon clouds. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, waterfalls sprang over cliffs, and streams surged under enormous rocks, lifting them like tender babies from their cribs. But even long ago, just as now, storms pass, the sky clears, and the sun shines. And even long ago, just as now, there may come a rainbow to mark the end of the storm. Now remember, where the rainbow touches the ground is a sacred place. That spot is a place of magic, a place of wish fulfillment. So keep your eyes on the rainbow, children. Follow the rainbow path of peace. Long ago, but not so long ago that there were no animals, one of those rainbow arms touched down in some very high mountains, the ones we now call the Andes. That rainbow arm touched down in a high place, a beautiful place, a cold place, a stony place, a place where long-legged animals browsed. Now, this rainbow was a wide rainbow. It was a large rainbow. It was a fine rainbow. It was, in fact, a rainbow with ambition. And this rainbow stretched like no other rainbow has before or since. And from one side of the sky to the other, this large, fine, ambitious rainbow stretched. It stretched, and it stretched, and it stretched until it found the perfect place for its other end. And its other end touched the earth in a low place, a fertile place, a lovely place. The other end of this big, beautiful, far-reaching rainbow came to ground in a low place, a hot place, a place of big cats and big birds and big flowers, a magnificent tropical basin deep in Mexico. And when the rainbow had both ends firmly on the ground, when the rainbow had placed both arms and both hands upon the mountains and in the basin, it began to dissolve. It gave itself away. It fell to earth in thousands of pieces. The rainbow fell to earth in colors: white, pink, red, yellow, orange, black, mottled, and more. The rainbow broke up into pieces, and every piece was a different color, and every piece fell to the ground and was welcomed into the earth. The colors did not fall on the ground like light. Light has no substance. The colors did not fall on the ground like water. Water keeps moving and changing. The colors did not fall on the ground like fire. Fire is jealous. It removes all competition. The colors fell on the ground in the form of substantial, reliable, cooperative seeds. The colors fell on the ground and became part of the earth. All the colors of the rainbow sprouted and took root and became beans. And the buzzing bees were happy, and they kissed every rainbow bean flower they could find, and they made sweet honey. And the four-legged herds were happy. They praised the richness of their milk and the health of their children when they ate the rainbow bean plants. And most of all, the two-leggeds were happy. They felt full when beans were on the menu, and they became fast friends, the two-leggeds and the beans, and they worked together to benefit the whole community of life. Beans have always been kind to people. Beans teach cooperation and patience as we wait for them to sprout, grow, flower, produce green pods, and finally, dry pods that burst open, revealing the rainbow of seeds. There are 1,800 named species of the bean family, and they are a mainstay foodstuff for humans, animals, and bees, and mainstay medicines in both the Eastern and Western traditions. They're also, as I've mentioned, and we'll get to it eventually, as the occasional hallucinogenic plant, as well as edible oils and soil remediation. This family, the bean family, is the third largest family in the world. And that is very special, not just because it's big, but because we know that the bean family is a fairly old family. And the way we think it works is this, that when a family of plants like the Fabaceae come into being on the planet, there's lots of them. It's like we're saying, let's try it this way, 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 let's try it this way. It's one of the ways we kind of can make a timeline of when the families of plants began to appear. Because the oldest families of plants, of course, had to go through several devastating planet-wide extinctions when very few plants or animals were able to survive. And so what happens then is over time, and we're talking millions and millions of years, the number of species in a plant family gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So we believe that the oldest plant families have the fewest number of species, and yet we know that the Fabaceae family is an old plant family from other internal evidence that we have, and so that it has this many species, the third greatest number of species on the planet, tells us that when it started, it was probably the queen of the lot. It probably had more species than any other family before or since. The so-called fruit of the flower of this family is a simple, single, seed-bearing pod that splits open along two seams, revealing one or more seeds. Think pea, think green bean, think shelled beans. Now, when you see the catalpa pod, and you say, oh, look, a long pod splitting open along two seams, and inside seeds, this big tree is a member of the bean family. Yes, it is indeed. Now, it can get a little bit confusing because people use the word bean to describe other seeds that aren't beans and that don't come in these kinds of pods. I'm sure you've heard of castor beans. They're not in this family. In coffee beans, definitely not in this family. Neither are vanilla beans. They're orchids. Or cocoa beans, again, a totally different family. So the fact that something's called a bean doesn't really mean much of anything, but if it's in the Fabaceae family, then we know that we are looking at the Phaseolus genus and the Fabaceae family. There are currently 40,000 bean varieties held in gene banks worldwide. Now, if you're going, wait a second, she just said there's 1,800 different species, and now she's saying there's 40,000 different varieties. That is confusing, isn't it? Well, there is a difference between a species and a variety. And the easiest way to think about this is to think about dogs. And there's certainly a difference between, say, a Saint Bernard and a lab and a dachshund. And yet those are not different species. They're different varieties. So the difference between a variety, which is also called a breed, and a species has to do with the definition of species. And this will probably change within our lifetimes because everybody admits that our definition of species is kind of a poor definition of species. But at this point, the way we define species is it breeds with each other. So if we have things that look dissimilar, but nonetheless they are willing to breed with each other, they're in the same species. So we can have 40,000 different varieties of a genus within a genus, the genus Phaseolus, in the family Fabaceae. And this genus includes only 55 species. So these 40,000 different varieties of beans have been brought into existence through the cultivation efforts of people, because people and beans have always worked together. And beans have a special ability, as we've already established, to be various. That's why I think of beans as the rainbow tribe, because they can be a lot of different things. Common beans, that's green beans and dried beans, are now grown in over 150 countries on over 60 million acres with a yearly harvest estimated at 20 million tons. And the wild ancestors of all of these beans still grow in the Andes Mountains and in Guatemala. These two ancestors were domesticated, so far as we can tell from the fossil record, about 11,000 years ago in both Peru and the Lerma-Santiago Basin in Mexico. Starch grains from beans have been found in human teeth dated 12,000 years ago. So we're pretty clear that our way back ancestors were eating wild beans, and I think it's also pretty clear then that they were saying to beans, beans, if we give you more of what you want, will you give us more of what we want? Here are some of the names of some of the beans that are available to us. To me, this is quite a poetic and amazing list. Scarlet runner beans, ayocote beans, patoya beans, botil beans, chomborote beans, Pilloi beans, Cuba beans, tepary beans, zimayam beans, tepari beans, polyanthus beans, zik beans, pilish beans, pataco beans, cache beans, matatropa beans, toda la vida beans. And the toda la vida beans are the least domesticated of all of the cultivated beans. Butter beans, lima beans, Burma beans, Siva beans, Duffin beans, Rangoon beans. Oh, my goodness, so many beans. Adzuki beans, ground beans, chickpeas, coral beans, cowpeas, black-eyed peas, yard-long beans, gour beans. You know that one, gour gum, you see it in your food. Horse-gram beans, hyacinth beans, Indian peas, jack beans, lentils, lupini beans, moth beans, mung beans, peas, pigeon peas, rice beans, sword beans, soybeans, tarwi beans, tuber pea beans, urad beans, black gram beans, velvet beans, and winged beans, people and beans. People and beans go back a long, long, long time. And we have made beans in many areas into a national food. So that if I'm served cannelli beans, I know someone who has Italian extraction has cooked for me. And if I'm being served black beans, I'm figuring that's somebody from Puerto Rico or Jamaica. And if I'm getting Anasazi beans, that's probably a native person from the desert Southwest. So it's almost as though we can locate ourselves on the planet by means of the beans that we choose and the beans that we include in our diet. Throughout the world, many, many people rely on a traditional diet of grain and beans for their primary protein. The amino acids, which are the protein building blocks, in grains and beans fit together like two pieces in a beautiful puzzle, each one adding pieces that the other doesn't have and becoming far more nutritious for us and for animals when we eat them together, the whole grains and the beans. And you probably remember the book by Frances Moore Laffey, Diet for a Small Planet, in which she talks about combining grains and beans and seeds. And she, in fact, got very kind of scientific and mathematic about it, and how much of this particular amino acid was in this particular bean and how much of this particular amino acid was in this kind of grain. And she actually suggested in the book that you had to like measure out, say, your peanut butter that you were going to put on your whole wheat bread to be sure that you got just the right amount so that those amino acids could work together. Well, I remember hearing her speak with her lovely daughter, and wonderful to see them working together. Some years after the publication of that book, and her with rather a blush on her cheek saying, I really got carried away there. Obviously, our ancestors who were eating like this were not measuring exactly how much peanut butter they were putting on their whole wheat bread. And so it turns out that our bodies have the capacity to carry amino acids from the bean family and amino acids from the grain family in our blood for up to 3 days. And so if you eat peanut butter in the morning and you have your bread at night, it's really okay. You don't even have to spread the peanut butter on the bread to get those amino acids to combine and to work together. Again, this is a friendly situation. It's not one that's fraught. We're not like struggling to get this. The beans do not resist us in the way the grains do. Think about how hard it is to get into the grains. Grains are really, really hard. Beans are hard too, but we soak them, we throw away the water, and we cook them, and suddenly we have something that is soft enough for a baby to eat. Even most grains, once they've been soaked and cooked, don't get soft enough for a baby to eat. This is one of the reasons why I really consider beans one of the mother foods. And of course, to the Native Americans of the area where I live, in the northeast part of North America, beans were one of the 3 sister crops: corn and beans and squash. And by this I mean hard winter squash, not zucchini, not courgettes, not the summer squash or patty pan squash, but the big hard orange squash. So squash and corn and beans, the 3 sister crops, the 3 pillars of nutrition on which they built their communities. The great peaceful nations, the ones whose wisdom and wise ways all Americans continue to live under. For they taught Benjamin Franklin, and they taught Thomas Jefferson how to create the very special democracy that the United States is. If you look at democracies anywhere else in the world, you will see that they are very, very different. So before we end this segment, I also must remind you of clover blossom honey, and that clover is a member of this great family, the bean family. Even though we don't eat beans, clover doesn't make a pod in the same way that the beans that we're focusing in on do, but it is a member of the family. We'll come back and we'll talk more about it. But right now, we just want to give a tip of the hat and a big grin to the bees and thank, once again, the bean family for making the bees so happy, which then allow the bees to make lots of honey that keeps them throughout the year so they can pollinate all the other flowers. And I also do want to mention that one of the few cultures that eats sprouts eats mung bean sprouts, but only fully cooked. So this is a limit that I usually put on sprouts, is only mung bean sprouts, only sprouted till they have their first two leaves, and only cooked. And that has just about used up our entire time here. I hope that you come over and visit me at SusunWeed.com or slide on over to the Wise Woman Bookshop. And that's also .com, and check out my books and all of my other offerings. Gemini and everybody there, thank you so much for jumping into Bountiful Beans with me. Green blessings, everyone.
This completes the first segment of our 8-part series, Bountiful Beans with Susun Weed at Time Monk Radio.